My dad has been a car mechanic for around 30 years, and in that time in his workshop he's built some incredible cars, like the Renault 5 Maxi Turbo Group B rally car and the Peugeot 206 WRC car. And while they are exceptional builds and feats of pure brilliance, there is one man who sat in his workshop in 1984 with an old used BMW and changed the course of history. That man's name is Max Reisbock, and this is the story of the BMW Touring. A quick reminder, if you're not already subscribed, do smash it for 2 videos every single week, including short documentaries like this. And if you want to support me on my way to owning one of my dream cars within the next 12 months, smash the like button and drop a comment down below. Tell me which car I should be buying, but let's get into it. Throughout the 20th century and still through to today, BMW made sports cars, sporty family cars, and executive cars. In the 1980s, this was still, of course, the case, and their lineup wasn't a million miles away from the one we see today, with the 3 Series, 5 Series, 6 Series and 7 Series across a couple of generations. Typically these cars came as saloons or coupes and had some kind of focus on either performance or luxury. No one at BMW had any intention of making an estate car. They weren't seen as luxurious or performant, so just weren't in keeping with the brand. There was a BMW 2002 Touring built, but it was definitely more of a compact hatchback and not an estate by any means. The only problem with there not being any estates was that the average family might struggle to get all of their belongings into a car on longer road trips, weekends away with pets and bikes and all that kind of stuff. BMWs really couldn't be the car for everything. That is, unless BMW made that car for themselves. Not many people know about this, and it kind of derails the entire story about Max Reisbock, but it's worth talking about anyway. In the 1970s, BMW had entered the World Rally Championship with their legendary BMW 2002, back to that name again. BMW needed a support car to carry equipment, the mechanics and anything else important to finishing a rally, and most of their competitors like Peugeot and Opel built big cars alongside their sportier offerings so could repurpose them for this duty. BMW, however, didn't have a big car or van for the job. That's when BMW Motorsport built 3 estates based on the E3 platform, also known as the New 6, which was also the basis for the hallowed BMW E9, the coupe version of the E3. These 3 BMW E3 estates, known as the E3 Kombi, serviced in 2002 in 1972 until in 1973 BMW gave up and decided it was an easier and cheaper option to run the Peugeot 504 estate as a support car instead. Quick fun fact to note about these, those E3 Kombis had an E9 CSL engine in them to make up for the additional weight, so they would have been quite punchy out on the roads. Today only one of these still exists thanks to one of the engineers buying one to carry his motorbike around in. This actually inspired BMW GB, who were seeing a lot of interest in estates elsewhere in the market. They worked with the main BMW agent, Langley Motors of Thames Ditton, to produce an estate conversion for the E3 Saloon. However, the E3 Saloon was already around double the cost of the average British saloon car, and this conversion skyrocketed that price even more, meaning that only around 12 were ever built, and only 1 still exists today, restored thanks to an enthusiast who's actually owned 3 other rotten examples that were used as parts to restore it. So all that is just to let you know that there was a history of BMW generally ignoring estate cars. When their main dealer built one, it was too expensive and failed. When BMW built one themselves, it was outshone by a cheap Peugeot. And I think without this context, you'll never fully appreciate what Max Reisbock did. Going back to where we started then, in the 1980s, BMW weren't making an estate, but they did have a lovely 3 Series saloon that was doing pretty well in the market, the E30, which also came as a coupe. BMW also had a Munich-based prototype engineer named Max who had a bit of a problem. He wanted to drive a BMW but also was worried that his young family would soon outgrow their saloon, as it was him, his wife and his 2 kids. How would they fit all their baggage, sports equipment, pets and all the rest in a boot that was about the same size as the modern day VW Polos? Max decided to build a car with a bigger boot that would suit his family's needs, using his knowledge as a prototype prototype engineer to create the perfect blend of BMW's premium and luxury vibe with the size and practicality of that Peugeot 504 estate I mentioned earlier. His wife agreed that it was a good idea, and they decided on a budget of around £22,000 in today's money, or 30,000 Deutschmarks at the time, to make it work. Max had no notes or diagrams written down, just what was in his head, and within a space of 6 months he pretty much built the entire thing by buying an old used 323i saloon, putting the car in his mate's workshop and using his own tools with no involvement from BMW. It used the rear windscreen from a VW Passat, plexiglass for the new rear windows, and the C-pillar was effectively just shifted to the back of the car with additional panelling built by Max to fill out the new area. On completing the car, he could have just taken it out and started driving. I mean, he had literally just spent £22,000 and 6 months of blood, sweat and tears into building this perfect car for himself. But he was worried that if it drew too much attention, he might get in trouble, especially because in his contract he wasn't allowed to make anything that wasn't officially sanctioned by BMW. So instead of driving the car he had just built, he reached out to his bosses to show them the car and get permission to take it out on the roads. What he didn't expect was for them to have such a positive reaction that a board member of BMW showed up to see it, followed by another one arriving at 7 AM the following day. For my younger viewers, board members of businesses are about as senior as it gets. These board members loved the car so much and were so impressed they took it off Max's hands in an instant. One said to Max, "The good news is that it's gorgeous, the bad news is that it must never leave BMW's premises again." So 6 months of hard work gone just like that, but of course Max was paid a nice little sum of money for his efforts, and BMW had a cheap route into building a touring version of their E30 series. It wasn't much money that Max got for this, but he himself along with his wife were just mostly proud that they'd had an impact. But that was just the beginning. What this car did was completely redefine how BMW would make their cars all the way through to today, but we'll get to that in a second. Let's finish the E30 Touring story. When the board members took the car to be produced, BMW's design team started to look at how the car could be modified to look just right, but the board members said no, and other than a few minor tweaks, the car that came into production in 1987 was effectively the same thing that Max built in his mate's workshop in 1984. What's funny and maybe tragic about that is that even though the car was released in 87, Max couldn't actually afford to own one himself and instead bought the cheaper VW minivan to take the family around in. But that's not the end of Max's touring story, we'll resolve that in a minute. I mentioned that the impact to BMW was huge, and genuinely it was. What it did was make the entire company understand the importance of full-size prototypes and models of future cars, to get a real feeling and perspective on what it will look like when produced. It meant that basically every single BMW, Mini, Rolls-Royce and anything else under BMW's control has first been built as a full-scale model by Max's team, before it finally reaches the roads, as an important step in making sure the car has the right impact in real life. That's why sometimes we see photos of BMWs that might look a bit odd, but I personally find that when you see them in person, often they look much better. When I saw the new M4 online, I didn't really like the look of it, but in person I think it's utterly beautiful, and it's great to know that the successors of Max's team, as he retired in 2008, stood around a model M4 and agreed that it looked sick before it came into production. I will need to see the new M2 in person though to be persuaded by it, as I agree it does look a bit odd. And then from a BMW perspective, this E30 Touring laid the foundations for a bunch of their larger cars today, not only the M3 Touring that we saw announced earlier in 2022, but cars like the M5 Touring, the many 3 and 5 Series estates that have come through each generation, and even to an extent the BMW 2 Series Active Tourer. They all have Max to thank for opening BMW's eyes to a world of making estate cars and larger family cars that could still be typically BMW in either their performance or luxury. Oh, and what about Max? Well, on the 2nd of February 1994, his birthday in fact, the final E30 Touring that left the production line was presented to him as a gift, after BMW had sold more than 100,000 3 Series estates over the 7 years the car ran for. You know what this reminds me of? The story of how Porsche laid the foundations for all exotic manufacturers to start building these larger, more practical cars, and you should definitely go and check out how they did that by clicking here.